This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me, you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is March 12th, 2021, and this is episode 230.
I'm Scott Lundebom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, we have a Canby Report-style roundup of the latest news in provincial and federal politics. Spring break's starting. I barely have the head to pay attention to what's happening in the news, and we dug through, and it seems like not a lot.
Is there even a spring break this year? I thought that was cancelled.
That was cancelled in Ontario. We still get it. So my sister-in-law, who's a teacher in Ottawa, has to work for the next 2 weeks. Her child's daycare is closed down due to an exposure notice. So they're unhappy, but spring break, woo! And we can see people outside again. First, thank you as always to the 100 people who contribute to keep this podcast going every month. You can join them and support the podcast at patreon.com/politicos. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's start the show off by talking about the Federal Conservative Party. Erin O'Toole has not had a great week in the headlines.
Not at all. This week has been, actually, I guess, week and a half now. It just seems to be a steady drip of trouble in CPC HQ stories, which to me says there's probably a little bit of backroom or caucus discontent if so much is rising to the surface.
There's like at least 2 flavors of stories. There's the horse race number stories. Eric Grenier in CBC and Philip Fournier in Maclean's both have their poll analysis, seeing that O'Toole's numbers are not strong. His personal numbers are pretty weak. The headline for Grenier's piece is Erin O'Toole has enjoyed no bump in the polls, unlike past Conservative leaders, and Fournier just says O'Toole's numbers sour. In a spring when Trudeau didn't do great on the initial vaccine rollout, the Conservatives struggled to really make headway. And now that vaccines seem to be picking up, it's hard to see where their obvious trend line back to relevancy is. The other raft of stories are more around the convention that's coming up March 18th to 21st. There's a few pieces in different sources talking about tensions within the Conservative caucus. This is a National Post piece, I think by Brian Platt, where, like you say, there are like insiders speaking to Platt and to the National Post going, maybe he doesn't have that much time left as leader. And then there's another piece about anti-abortion groups seeking to dominate the policy convention since they can all just join virtually and don't need to afford to fly to a new city.
Yeah, not been a good week media-wise for O'Toole. And I think that's actually just been more of a problem than just this week. And this, I think, is related to the bigger problem. It's incredibly cliched at this moment to talk about how unprecedented these times are, but it really has not been a normal year. And almost no opposition party, with the exception of the Alberta NDP, because Jason Kenney keeps face planting or stepping on rates. More like the Simpsons where Sideshow Bob keeps like walking from rate to rate, stepping on it and whacking himself in the face. That's basically been Jason Kenney's last year. And short of screwing up to that extent, no opposition party has really been able to gain any traction. And in some respects, the lack of a polling bump for a new leader just seems to be a function of that more than anything else. We basically, the only times anyone generally sees O'Toole in the media at all is when something goes bad and it raises to the level of the reporters paying attention, putting stories out. It's just been a really hard year much more so than normal for opposition parties to get traction. And even in normal good times, opposition parties really struggle to get press coverage, get their message out, and everything going virtual, not having the usual scrums in Ottawa after question period. All of these little things add up to a situation where it's just really difficult for any opposition leader to do well in. So in that respect, I'm actually not surprised to see O'Toole struggling.
There's like a chicken and egg kind of situation here as well, where the polls aren't doing well and his caucus is not fully united. There's discontent that we're seeing, and I'm not sure which is driving the other. Like you say, it's very difficult for most opposition parties to succeed. Like you look at Ontario right now, and Doug Ford's not done an amazing job, but he's done a mediocre job. It's not the worst, it's not the best, and his poll numbers are pretty strong. So maybe it was the poll numbers aren't doing great, and so you couple that with the challenge of keeping the Conservative coalition together, and there's going to be this unease in the backbench.
I think the causality flows more from bad or not great poll numbers to the discontent within the party, because let's face it, outside of people like us who pay attention to this stuff, spend a lot of time each week reading news stories, spending too much time on Twitter, all of these things that lead us to be relatively well informed about the goings on in various political parties in Ottawa, most Canadians aren't paying attention to the day-by-day stuff. So the fact that there's some dissatisfaction in the backbenches of the Conservative Party isn't the sort of thing that normally rises to the level of the general population taking that information and incorporating it into their views on who they're going to vote for. So in that respect, I really do think it comes from the bad polling leading to the discontent. And O'Toole is trying to pivot the party in a way that I think is actually what they really need to be doing. I think the early moves he made after winning the leadership race through August and September were the right moves for any Conservative Party leader to be made, to actually try and change the party into something that wasn't just a regional party of Alberta and Saskatchewan and the eastern half of BC. But because of all the other problems and not fully committing or executing well on that strategy, there hasn't been the poll number rise that one would expect if it was actually a good strategy, which I think it is. And as a result, there isn't any reassurance among party members that the change in direction and maybe upsetting a little bit of the orthodoxy is leading to results.
Yeah, it's worth remembering in the previous leadership race following the 2015 election, O'Toole ran as a kind of centrist, for the Conservatives, moderate. In this more recent campaign, he swung to the true blue and tried to pick up some of the more populist Conservatives, almost not to the level of Maxime Bernier or anything. And so I think there was a lot of uncertainty about which was the real O'Toole. But I think after, like you're saying, he swung back to be a more moderate leader, which I was happy to see. And he's taken some strong stances, even in the last couple of weeks, with a letter saying that the Conservative Party wants to be a welcoming party, which is good language. It's interesting, though, to look at this Fournier piece in Maclean's, where he links to the Abacus poll, where it looks at people's impressions of O'Toole and the other leaders from the other parties. And outside of the Conservative Party, no one likes Erin O'Toole. It's shocking. Only 10% of Green and Bloc members say they have a positive impression, 8% of Liberals and 5% of New Democrats. Now, obviously, very few parties like the other leaders. But when we look at the impressions of Trudeau, more Conservatives like Trudeau than any of the parties like O'Toole. 11% of Conservatives say they have a positive impression of Trudeau. Jagmeet Singh's lowest number is 17% of Conservatives like him. They're all more popular with other parties than O'Toole was. And the argument here is that if O'Toole doesn't have a lot of positives in the other parties, he can't pull voters from those parties that easily. Now, there's a lot of unknowns sitting out there where he can still define himself, but he's also got really high negatives with a number of the parties. So a lot of work to be done, and it's an uphill battle, like more so than I would have expected. People just have not taken to him.
I think the stuff's all fixable, but it is going to take a lot of work, and there isn't an easy path to doing it, particularly when you can't be doing big in-person events. And maybe that's, if I'm the Liberals, maybe that's going to pull the plug earlier rather than later, because the sooner in-person events can start up again, probably it's going to be better for the opposition parties. But yeah, it's just a tough go around all there. Like I said, I think he's taking the right big picture moves, but the execution after the first couple months really seemed to have wavered, and pretty much every bit of press the Conservatives have gotten since, I don't know, maybe that Labor Day video he put out has been not great. A couple like decent stories where they're criticizing the Liberals on vaccine rollout, but weren't really able to offer a compelling case on how they could have done better. And it's a tough spot for them. And generally, I think right of center parties are in a not great place right now, particularly if they don't want to go down the populist route. Just because it really does seem like the broad projects that they've been under, the broad political projects that the center has undertaken in the past couple decades have more or less hit their natural end point. And there isn't a huge amount of animated ideas on where to take it from here, which does make it challenging.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen in the last two leadership races is the Conservative Party is really split almost right down the middle, 50-50, into that more populist Doug Ford, not quite Trump in Canada, but definitely like a Doug Ford populism, even Jason Kenney to some extent. And then another half that's wanting to go back to the progressive conservative days, or even just like the more moderate Harper days.
Yeah.
And not quite sure exactly what that looks like. And that tension, I think, is what it looks like it might explode at the convention. Like, I think there's a chunk of that populist base that's really mad about Derek Sloan getting booted from caucus, and that's really frustrated with this more moderate trend that O'Toole is trying to turn to.
Yeah, the problem, though, going with that populist play to the base approach, though, is they really can't grow their vote at all that way. It's politically a dead end. So what if they can squeeze out another 5% in rural areas in the prairies in Ontario? Like, it doesn't help if to go from 65 to 70% of the vote. It's the only real path forward means winning in suburban ridings and maybe a stretch urban riding or two, particularly if the vote splits a certain way. But that really is the only path forward. And it can't necessarily just be, we're going to be the Liberal Party light, because if people are given the choice between two Liberal parties, they're just going to vote for the actual Liberal Party, the genuine article. But
you don't have to tell me as a NDP supporter.
Yeah, that does leave them in a difficult spot. So I think O'Toole's early moves to try and position the Conservative Party as more of a, I guess, working class approach. Conservative parties have not had a great ability to pivot in here, despite, I think, a lot of interest from a lot of their leadership ranks around doing it. And to the extent they have been successful, it's really been more of a cultural thing than a economic policy side, which is still not particularly well aligned in that respect. But yeah, it's going to be a tough move. And the only real, I think, path that I can really see is a more kind of pocketbook issue party that, I guess from their perspective, wouldn't really be doing what they would see as wasting time on a lot of the kind of cultural change, what some members would probably go as far as to call virtue signaling stuff. Just basically be not a party that's explicitly anti that, but not interested in doing any of that stuff. And that's going to be a fine line to walk while trying to make inroads in the cities and suburban areas. But yeah, convention coming up. I don't know. Like, a lot's been made about this, but unless things go like horribly wrong, I don't think it's actually gonna matter. What was the last election that was in any way influenced by a policy convention prior to it?
I don't think it comes up directly, but what it can do is help shape or break narratives. I have no clue how it's going to go as an online convention. It could either be even more successfully stage managed than in-person conventions, which are incredibly managed by all political parties these days, or hell, it could go totally off the rails with so many people able to just get their voice in. And if they're organized, as many of the anti-abortion groups tend to be, it could generate a whole waft of new stories, which will probably be forgotten by an election, but may leave a taste in people's mouths of a party that is run by bigots and extremists, even if that's not true at the top.
Go as far. The NDP and Liberals will do everything they can to paint it that way, and that'll have resonance among their base and everything. But I think if anything is that the bigger risk for the Conservative Party isn't that they come away with that image, it's that they come away being a party that doesn't know what it wants and appears to be pulled in two directions more so than anything else. And I don't know, I can't think of the last time a party ever actually won an election while appearing so internally inconsistent in what they stand for.
Doug Ford.
Even
he just didn't stand for anything. He didn't have a platform, so.
Bucket beer. He was going to be the person who made beer cheaper. And that was like a clear, solid pitch. Didn't like the carbon tax, wanted cheaper beer. You knew what you were getting with Ford.
Speaking of cheaper beer, should we talk about the think tank that wants you to have cheaper beer? Now,
from the way you've described this, that almost makes me think, I don't know, Fraser Institute, I don't know, maybe
McDonald.
Pardon?
Maybe McDonald Laurier.
Yeah, that's... Yeah, being one of those, the pro-business, small government, anti-tax think tanks. Is that who put this out?
No, this is a report from the Broadbent Institute, which is like all of those think tanks we've named are officially independent and nonpartisan, but the Broadbent Institute is clearly the NDP think tank, being that it was founded by former leader Ed Broadbent. But they've released this report called Moving Toward Fairness in Taxation, an examination of beer taxation in Canada, which argues effectively our excise taxes are too high, and if we're going to pay for COVID recovery, we absolutely should not further tax breweries.
Yeah, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to add more taxes on breweries. I like beer. It'd be nice if beer was cheaper, but I just, beyond just the basic wanting general consumer goods, of which drinks are a good to be consumed, there isn't a compelling policy reason that I can really think why you necessarily want it, especially because alcohol isn't without its costs to society, both in terms of dumb shit people do when drunk and the longer term health effects of consuming too much.
Yeah. Like, the report goes into detail about the amount of money the beer industry supposedly contributes to the economy. They say $13.6 billion in GDP in 2019, and in 2016, an estimated $5.7 billion in tax revenue for provincial and federal governments. I'm still trying to figure out like why the Broadbent Institute, but as I scrolled to the bottom of their website, I noticed the like union tag on there, and that might be some of the hint at it. Like, the Broadbent Institute would receive some funding from unions, I suspect, and is broadly supportive of unionized industries. And there is a little bit in this report about how some breweries some, especially the larger breweries and some of the growing microbreweries are starting to unionize. And maybe that's where it connects to that, and or it's maybe just appeal to the working class beer drinking supporter base.
Could be. Although at this point, I think the NDP supporter base that drinks beer is more likely to be urban hipsters than the working class.
Someone who just tried to go to the new microbrewery in my neighborhood, but didn't want to sit in a 25-minute wait to get a table on their new patio. Yeah, fair enough. But when I get takeaway beer from there, it's like $4 a can. So maybe I can have some sympathy with this. Craft beer is very expensive. Anyway, we'll throw a link to this report in the show notes. It's interesting. Beer is apparently more expensive here than any state in the US, at least in terms of how much tax is paid on your can of beer. They also compare us to Europe, and Finland seems to be the only country in Europe that pays higher portion of taxes on their cases than any Canadian province. Sweden is higher than most provinces, about half the provinces. Alberta and Quebec are the provinces that have the lowest excise taxes, and those are still above the European average.
Yeah, if you're in Eastern Canada, Quebec is the place to go for cheap beer.
Now, Alberta and Quebec are also the two provinces with drinking ages of 18. So kids can get drunk cheaper.
Well, speaking of things that cost people a lot of money, the ICBC ruling is that we discussed last week or the week before is going to appeal, as this week Attorney General David Eby announced that they were going to appeal the decision that ruled their proposed changes to the Evidence Act regarding expert witnesses and other changes related to insurance payouts and disputes was unconstitutional.
Yeah, there's not much beyond that to update on this story. We're appealing to the Court of Appeal. We don't know what the government's arguments are going to be yet. We don't even know if they're going to ask for a stay of the lower court decision so that cases can continue to be heard at the Civil Resolution Tribunal in the interim. I would suspect that's likely. But yeah, we'll just keep following this. It's mostly just an update for completeness. Next up, something we haven't ever really touched on the podcast, I think, but one of our patrons flagged it for us as actually a pretty important story. There's an update to the status of the old growth forests in BC. A group of environmental charities a group of environmental charities called the Ancient Forest Alliance that are with Sierra Club BC and the Wilderness Committee have released a new report card on the BC government's progress on protecting old growth forests. 6 months ago, the provincial government released a report from an independent panel that gave a number of recommendations to protect our old growth forests. These reports were actually somewhat troubling, suggesting that we're down to 13 million hectares of old forests in BC, and as much of 80% of that consists of smaller trees with lower commercial values. So the risk of biodiversity loss in these old growth forests in the province, which are some of the most biodiverse places in Canada, is pretty high. I guess the management practices we've been undertaking over the last few years and couple decades are putting them more at risk than they should be. We're allowing a certain amount of logging to go in that threatens the forests. The environmentalists and ecologists are very concerned. It's a very difficult process, and I'm sure it will take a while to turn this around, but given climate change, I would hope we'd want to keep our old growth forests alive and healthy.
Oh, definitely. I don't know, I'm always a little, I guess, skeptical would be the right word of this, just because activist organizations, which this is a report by, always have an incentive to be asking for the more the next thing, which I'm not saying necessarily wrong here. I'd just be curious what the views are by people that aren't specifically trying to aim for specific policy measures to be brought in. Because there have been past waves of changes brought in to protect old growth forests, and they, like typical government policy don't make everyone happy, but do seem to be a not unreasonable compromise in many respects. So it's an issue I don't know a huge amount about, but I'm always just curious when it comes from activist groups rather than, say, university research.
Yeah, the CTV article that we'll link to has a few voices from like the UBC, from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and from the Forestry Ministry and the BC Council of Forest Industries, in addition to the more activist groups, all taking slightly different tacks. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs was speaking with in a joint letter with conservation groups, wanting to make sure funding for First Nations would be tied in with the economic diversification in old growth forest development, for example, ecotourism, stewardship programs. The Council of Forest Industries is on board with making sure the future of the industry is on a sustainable path. The Forest Minister, Katrine Conroy, flagged that I think COVID-19 ended up being a big impediment to implementing a lot of the recommendations as quickly as they intended to. The reports that came out or were given to the government were handed to them like just before the pandemic broke, so they didn't have as much of a chance to get to things. I'll definitely be digging more into this in the future, and hopefully we can come back to it and see where things are going.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, it's like salmon, right? It's one of those things that's very fundamental to British Columbia, and it's a constant fight, but one that neither of us, I think, have deep wells of knowledge on.
Yeah. And the forestry industry is really important, not just for the economic benefits that it brings to BC, but because the products it generates have important uses. And you mentioned climate change earlier, but one of the things as a province we're trying to do on climate change is move away from having such a concrete heavy construction industry. And while there are some aspects of that there just aren't good substitutes for concrete on, one area where there is decent substitutes is for building medium to tall buildings with mass timber, and we want to be able to take advantage of that. So it really is a balancing act, and there are climate benefits to being able to use wood, and we just need to do that in a good way.
In terms of lands that are being protected, there's an interesting little piece in CBC about how the Land Conservancy of British Columbia has partnered with the Sonic Leadership Council to give back island to its original inhabitants. There's a 9.67 acre island off the east coast of Sydney Island near Victoria, most recently known as Halibut Island, but has now been renamed Siskiyou, that I guess the Land Conservancy bought for $1.5 million, and they are just giving it to the local First Nations and the original inhabitants of it. In other words, it's literal land back to the people who were the original stewards of it. It's a cool story.
Yeah, I've sailed or kayaked by that island a couple times. It's the whole area there is pretty nice. I don't really have much of a take beyond that, but yeah, it seems like a decent initiative by the Land Conservancy.
Yeah, the island's largely untouched. It's described in the story as an ecological and cultural jewel. It's never really been developed. It's fairly wild. A UBC forestry professor quoted in this is a big fan of visiting the land and doing surveys of it. Yeah, it looks really beautiful, and it's a good step in the right direction. I think it's neat to see this because it's not a government initiative. It's actually just a private nonprofit that went, we took this, our job is to make sure it's protected. What better way to protect it than to give it back to the original protectors of it? Yeah. Do more of that, nonprofits who have the capacity to.
Pivoting back to Ottawa, there was some news today on the Governor General front in terms of filling the vacant spot left by the resignation of Julie Payette. I guess it would be, 2 months ago now? That January, right? I don't know, my sense of time's all messed up.
It could have been yesterday for all I know.
I don't think it was quite that recently. But yeah, the Governor General's position has been vacant for a little while now. And after not really hearing anything about it since the sudden but probably overdue resignation, the Trudeau government announced this week that they are establishing a panel to choose the Governor General to succeed Julie Payette. This is a return to the system that Prime Minister Harper brought in when he selected David Johnstone, the replacement for Michel Jean.
The panel Harper had was, we looked it up, a lot of bureaucrats, like very senior ceremonial type bureaucrats, as well as political scientists, people like the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at McGill and a political scientist at University of Calgary, and people with titles like Secretary to the Governor General and Secretary to the Queen in Canada, I think.
Yeah, you can't forget probably the best title of the bunch, the Usher of the Black Rod of the Senate. But yeah, the Harper Committee on Vice-Regal Appointments seemed very much built around academics and senior parliamentary or aides to various regal and vice-regal positions. Trudeau's approach maintains some of that, but also goes in a slightly different direction. So it's going to be chaired by Intergovernment Affairs Minister Dominique LeBlanc. It's already slightly more partisan than the previous version, but it's also going to include Janice Charnett, the former UK High Commissioner and now acting clerk of the Privy Council, Inuit leader Nathan Obed, Université de Montréal rector Danielle Jurtas, former secretary to the Governor General Judith Larocque, and what is probably the oddest pick of the bunch is interim Canada Post Chair Suramatra Sanatini. Probably mispronounced that badly.
I think it's Suramitra Sanatani.
Suramitra Sanatani. It wouldn't be a Pledge's episode without mispronouncing at least one thing.
So yeah, a mix of the similar kind of ceremonial/academic posts, as well as some Indigenous representation, which is nice to see, and then a partisan or two, depending how independent you still consider the Privy Council to be.
Admittedly, after the SNC-Lavalin affair, its non-partisan bona fides were somewhat tarnished. Although I don't think there's any reason to necessarily think the acting clerk is a particularly partisan person. So yeah, I think this is a very good move on their part, something they should have kept rather than discarded it when they were making their previous decision on the successor to David Johnson. He was a fine Governor General. And yeah, if we can get another person of similar acumen and prestige, I think we'd do well. And it'll be interesting to see where this panel comes out and who they recommend. Ultimately, this is merely an advisory panel, as constitutionally the decision solely rests with the Prime Minister's recommendation to the Queen, but following the decision of this panel, I think is what they will be looking to do.
Hot take, maybe they should just pick Meghan Markle to really just piss off the royal family.
That would be quite a hot take. I'm not sure straining UK-Canadian relations would be necessarily the best idea at the moment, but yeah, that is definitely a hot take.
I don't think there's a requirement the Governor General has to be Canadian. Like, obviously the first few were British, but yeah, I assume they'll pick someone.
I think
she's living in Canada now, but I don't know if she has citizenship yet.
I thought they were living in the States. Anyway, I believe it's at the very least an informal requirement, and I'm pretty confident there's a 0% chance that they will pick a non-Canadian citizen for the role.
One of the more curious decisions by the Trudeau Liberals was this recent announcement in this wasn't even too recent of an announcement. This came out in the 2020 fall economic statement, but a number of groups have started speaking out about this, is there was a cut of $4 million to the Center for Equitable Library Access and the National Network for Equitable Library Services. Basically, the government said over the next 4 years, we are going to phase out their funding, which is $4 million a year. And the reason people are up in arms is because these two organizations do a significant amount of heavy lifting in providing reading materials for people with disabilities such as blindness, dyslexia, Parkinson's, and cerebral palsy. Which, why are you cutting libraries for people with disabilities when it's frickin' pennies on the government's budget?
Yeah, this is such a weird decision on their part. And I won't go as far to say there's never a time where the government is going to be facing some significant constraints and needs to take a really hard look at every penny that goes out, or I guess nickel now that we don't have pennies anymore. But this program, by all accounts, is just a good program that provides a lot of benefits to a group that could certainly use them. And it just is just so weird when literally money is flowing out by the billions every day, and there's just hasn't really... the government is basically doing the exact opposite of fiscal constraint or restraint right now, so why pick this one? It is just bizarre.
Yeah, the Minister Qualtrough's office had some platitudes to say that they support accessible reading materials and working with different partners, but they didn't really address the why. And so you have disability advocates, you have the NDP, you have a number of other MPs starting to speak out about this, all just going, come on, keep the books coming. Knowledge is useful.
Yeah, I'm just so confused by this. Just not only for the reasons I just mentioned, but government programs and the bureaucracy, which there will be part of it that administers this, tend to just act with inertia. There must have been a decision at some point somewhere that decided that the status quo was not good enough or shouldn't continue, and that it needed to be changed. But what was the thing that actually prompted that, and what the hell were they thinking?
The other issue that seems to be suffering from a little too much inertia is the lack of action in this country on paid sick days, especially here in British Columbia. It was a year ago now, or it was a year ago yesterday, that the World Health Organization, I believe, declared COVID-19 a pandemic. And it was a few weeks after that BC amended the Employment Standards Act to create unpaid sick leave for the first time in this province as a guaranteed you wouldn't lose your job. And then Horgan promised to lobby the federal government aggressively to get paid sick leave so no one would leave their job. And we got half that, kind of. We got a COVID sickness benefit where if you have to miss a week of work, you can get $500 from the federal government, which is better than nothing, but also, since it's retroactive and requires you to miss most of a week's worth of work, doesn't help you on that day where you're like, I'm not feeling well this morning, but I might be feeling better tomorrow because it's just a bug. I guess I have to go in, kind of situation if you don't have a ton of money. The CCPA has a policy note out that really looked at sick pay this week, especially in light of International Women's Day, which was on Monday. The numbers in here are quite fascinating. It points out that over half of workers in BC, 53%, don't have any employer-paid sick days. This is significantly higher for people earning under $40,000 a year. And those are industries largely dominated by women, whether it's carers, cleaners, servers, really the people who've been the front lines of COVID-19. Especially people on temporary contracts, people who are permanent residents. So there's an immigration question there. It's really one of those things where it's just like, why haven't we done this yet? in some manner.
Yeah, it's makes no sense to me why we haven't done this. First off, that the BC government doesn't need to wait for the feds on this at all. Labour policy is a provincial responsibility. It's not like BC is in particularly tight financial constraints at all. They can do this if they want to. There is some buck passing going on by the NDP at the moment on this one. So, like, it's not a problem with provincial federal relations. It's, for whatever reason, the NDP not wanted to take responsibility for their constitutionally mandated role and actually doing it themselves. And yeah, on the actual policy, the general culture around working, and particularly working while sick, was not good at all pre-pandemic, and depending on the workplace, it hasn't changed that much, especially if you're not sick with the very specific symptoms of concern at the moment. Like, that's honestly just doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, you don't want people who are sick coming in and getting other workers sick. It's going to cause more problems to a workplace in the long run than it would just to have someone miss a day of work or two anyway. And this is one of those policies where I don't even think you need to start breaking down the distributional or equity impact at all, because the policy just makes sense at, the first order analysis on it before even cracking into any second order effects on it.
I think that was just a nice hook to use on International Women's Day to say, here's the gender lens reason.
So if your goal is to, convince the NDP to do stuff, it's written in very NDP language, which they're the government. So if you're going to try and convince policy changes, writing it in the dialect of the governing party is probably a good way to go about it. But yeah, it's not necessarily how all people think and approach these issues.
Maybe we'll get a bill. I'm not holding my breath. I would love to see something, even if they have to provide a back pay subsidy to business to cover it. But
yeah,
the battle is happening in Ontario as well. And I was just double checking articles to see where the state of that is. And small business coalitions are even coming out in favor of a legislated sick leave policy.
Yeah, small businesses like where it's toughest to, because they're typically the businesses with the narrowest margins and the least excess funds and financial capacity to absorb anything. But yeah, even if they're supportive of it, there's no reason not to go for it. Yeah, Ontario government's their own special thing.
Let's end with one thing where I want to applaud the BC government that came out this past week. It was announced that the Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation Ministry has made 600 changes to language across the regulations of 15 ministries using the red tape reduction mechanisms brought in by the last government for the what's being called by Lindsay Tedds on Twitter, the NDP's approach to red tape reduction. They have removed gendered language across the rules and regulations across all these various ministries. So this is things like simplifying from he and she to just they, or taking references to brother or wife out to more gender neutral terms to be more inclusive of people of all gender identities. There's a remaining 3,400 instances of language across the rest of BC's laws. So definitely a lot more work to be done there by the ministry. I think we know some of the people involved in that, and they're really proud of this. And I think they should be. It's one of those little changes that most people won't notice, but for those, especially non-binary people and trans British Columbians, this means a lot to make sure that your government at least acknowledges and recognizes your existence.
And that has been Playcoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playcoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playcoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playcoast is a production of Legend Boot Media and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.